For John Clare, as with other romantics, nature was best enjoyed in its immediate natural state, free, open, and beautiful. In his poems I Dreaded Walking Where There Was No Path and Badger, these exact sentiments are highlighted, presenting nature as a symbol of freedom, or perhaps critiquing mankind destroying this. Walking through the natural world was no longer accessible for fellow peasant poets or simply working class, socially marginalised people like Clare, due to the series of enclosure acts that were passed in the 18th and early 19th century. The acts divided, fenced and enclosed the common land of England and its countryside, transforming the previously open land into private enclosures for agricultural maximisation and distribution. The Industrial Revolution had finally sunk its claws into the natural world, and these claws still exist today. In the name of profit and progress, the freedom of nature has been and continues to be diminished. Clare's poetry explores these political opinions, asserting that the Enclosure Acts, and more largely industrialisation, are an offence against the natural world, perpetuating both topographical and class divisions. Clare's poetry highlights the Enclosure Act's effects on the working classes. In I Dreaded Walking, Clare's tone fluctuates between unease and serenity. His emotions, conveyed through dreaded, cautious and feared, juxtapose the description of nature, which is so beautiful the speaker must venture on, despite his clouded emotions. The speaker reveals that his thoughts are preoccupied with the worry of trespassing, and this affects his experience of walking through nature. The land, which was once welcoming to peasantry, providing them opportunities of work and sustainable living, had now been enclosed, eliminating their rights to the land which existed for generations. In applying this context of the Enclosure Act to the poem, trespassing becomes all the more significant, a protest against industrialisation and the profitability of the common land. Clare portrays society's reaction to this act of political rebellion through the imagined reactions of strangers who frowned at the speaker. In light of this argument, it is significant to note that the word trespass can mean a transgression, a breach of law or duty, an offence, sin, wrong, a fault. In choosing to walk through privately owned land, the speaker is committing both a violation of law but also a biblical and cultural sin, and in this, Clare actively demonstrates an act of political defiance against the Enclosure Act, environmental abuse, and capitalistic values. Richard D.G. Irvine and Mina Gorgi claim that Clare's poetry reflects the experience of rural life from the perspective of someone who worked in and with the land. In light of this, the theme of ownership in the sonnet becomes significant in the final heroic couplet, but having naught I feared never alone, and cannot use another's as my own. This is simultaneously a plea against enclosure, critiquing class structure and capitalist values, whilst also referring to Clare's desire to be alone in the natural world with nature, his native fields, forests and paths, as his companion. Contrastingly, the exploration of the Enclosure Act and the oppression of the natural world in Badger is more ambiguous and symbolic. While it cannot be denied that the poem condones badger baiting and presents the sport in a nostalgic way, it also must be noted that Clare laments the changes in the sport and how it has been distorted. The badger's suffering is not presented humorously, but is instead presented as a symbol of resistance and heroism. Despite its ultimate defeat, the badger, a symbol of the natural world, drives the dogs all away, and beats them all, in a courageous feat. In this, Clare highlights nature's resistance to mankind's intervention, appropriation and exploitation. Additionally, the opposition of this nostalgic appraisal of the sport and the depiction of tamed badgers is widely different. A tamed badger never bites the men, and thus can be used advantageously and to put on a greater spectacle. Alan Bewell asserts that, where Clare wrote about and sought to preserve the one nature that he knew and valued, the gentry and professional classes knew many, and they were intent upon translating them and remaking them to suit their specific needs. In applying this claim, while Clare's poem is not a critique of badger baiting, it can certainly be argued that it is an extended metaphor for the natural world and represents a capitalist attempt to pervert and twist nature, taming it for corrupt purposes. Like the badgers that have been tamed for human advantage, nature has become distorted for profitable, exploitative purposes such as the Enclosure Act. In this, the badger becomes symbolic of resistance to such political policies and ideologies and even the ruling class. The final lines of the poem, "and runs away from the noise and hollow trees, burnt by the boys to get a swarm of bees," reveals Clare's pity that the tamed, changed badger can no longer identify with the natural world from which it came. In this, nature has forever been changed and manipulated by mankind, and the boy's act of burning the tree is a final metaphor for this corruption. In conclusion, both Badger and I Dreaded Walking mourn the exploitation of the natural world through enclosure and highlight the social effects that this had on the working class. The Badger and the speaker in I Dreaded Walking are representations of the social and ecological destruction that the Industrial Revolution and newly emerging capitalistic values triggered in Clare's society, and both poems explore arbitrary ownership rights to the natural world. These were key concerns for Clare, a peasant poet whose first-hand experience of nature differed to his contemporaries, in that industrialization and government policies such as the Enclosure Acts directly impacted his experience of the world and his very existence as an individual who depended on the land for livelihood. Consequently, his poems explore both the oppression of the natural world and also that of class oppression, wherein the ruling classes have more opportunity to exploit both workers and nature for their benefit.